Emily stared at the plain white paper in her hands, the ink of her signature still fresh. It was strange how a marriage could end with nothing more than a few strokes of a pen. Years of her life, her dreams of a family, and the promises she once believed in all reduced to an official document declaring her divorced. She thought she would feel free, but instead, she felt heavier than ever. The courthouse doors closed behind her, and the world outside seemed louder, colder, and far too big for a woman carrying a baby and a heart full of fears. Her son, barely a year old, was fast asleep in her arms. His soft breathing was the only thing that kept her from breaking down completely. She whispered to herself, "It's just you and me now," though the words frightened her. She had no real plan, no home to go back to, and very little money in her wallet. Her friends had grown distant over the years, and her family lived too far away to lean on. That left her with only one option, a cheap motel she had passed many times on the edge of town. The building looked as tired as she felt. Its paint was peeling, and the neon sign flickered as though it might burn out at any moment. She pushed the door open and walked into the lobby, clutching her baby and her small bag. The man at the front desk gave her a glance that told her he had seen many broken people walk through that door. He didn't ask questions. He simply slid a key across the counter after she handed him a few crumpled bills. Room 12 smelled faintly of old carpet and cleaning spray. The walls were thin, and she could hear a television playing faintly from next door. She sat on the edge of the bed, holding her son close, and for a moment, the weight of everything she had lost came crashing down. Her marriage had been far from perfect, arguments that never ended, silence that lasted for days, and a husband who eventually stopped looking at her as if she mattered, but at least it had been something. Now she had nothing but the echo of those memories and the uncertain road ahead. That night, she laid her baby down on the bed beside her and sat quietly, staring at the ceiling. The motel light outside leaked through the thin curtains, casting a pale glow across the room. She wanted to cry but forced herself to stay calm. She couldn't afford to fall apart, not when her child needed her to be strong. She brushed her fingers gently across his tiny hand and whispered, "I'll figure it out, I promise." Still, her thoughts refused to settle. Every noise seemed louder in that little room. A car drove past outside, its headlights cutting across the window. A door shut somewhere down the hallway. And then, from the room next door, came the sound of movement, slow, heavy steps on the floor, as if someone was pacing. She froze for a moment, listening. The steps stopped, and then a chair scraped lightly against the floor. Whoever was in that room seemed restless too. She told herself not to worry. People in motels kept to themselves. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling that the person next door was carrying a weight of their own, a kind of invisible burden she could almost feel through the wall. It was strange, but in some small way, knowing she wasn't the only one awake with a troubled mind brought her a flicker of comfort. The next morning, the world didn't look any brighter. She woke to the sound of her baby crying, his tiny fists waving in the air. She rocked him gently, humming a lullaby she had sung since the day he was born. She remembered how, during her marriage, she often sang to her baby alone while her husband worked late or stayed out with friends. Those moments had always been hers, and now they were all she had left. Emily pulled on her jacket and decided to walk to a nearby store. The motel wasn't in the best part of town, but she didn't have a choice. Balancing her baby on one hip, she carried a bag of diapers and formula back to her room, her arms aching with the weight. As she passed the door to room 13, the one beside hers, she noticed it was slightly open. For a second, she thought she saw someone inside, a man sitting at a small table, but before she could look again, the door shut quietly. Back in her room, she sat on the bed and let out a long sigh. She felt invisible, like the world had gone on spinning and left her behind. Yet even in the silence, she couldn't ignore the faint presence of her neighbor. The television came on and off, sometimes the sound of footsteps, sometimes nothing at all. Whoever he was, he seemed to live in the same quiet loneliness she did. That night, she held her baby close again, watching the shadows shift across the room. The divorce papers were folded neatly in her bag, as if she needed proof that this new life was real. She thought about the promises she once believed in, how she had pictured her family's future, and how it had all disappeared in a single day. Yet here she was, surviving the first night, even if barely. And though she didn't know it yet, the man in the next room had noticed her too. He had seen her struggling with groceries, had heard the soft sound of her baby crying through the thin walls. He didn't step forward, not yet, but he felt the same pull, the quiet recognition of someone else who carried a broken story. Emily had no idea that her life, which felt like it had ended with divorce, was about to take a turn she never could have imagined. Daniel sat on the edge of the bed in room 13, staring at the same cracked wallpaper he had looked at for weeks. The motel wasn't much, but it was the only place he could afford after life had stripped almost everything from him. He used to live in a big house, filled with laughter, tools, and plans for the future. Now he lived in a small room where silence pressed against him harder than the walls. Once, he had been a proud contractor, the kind of man who built homes for other families. He loved the smell of fresh wood and the sound of hammers ringing in rhythm with dreams being created. But all that ended the day of his accident. A fall at a construction site left him with injuries that took years to heal. The recovery drained his savings, cost him his business, and eventually pushed away the few people he had left. The world forgot about him, and in time, he felt he had forgotten about himself too. He lived day to day now, spending what little money he had saved on rent for the motel. He avoided people, preferring not to answer questions or face the pity in their eyes. Still, despite his efforts to stay invisible, he noticed the young woman who checked into the room next to his. She carried a baby on her hip and looked as though the weight of the world was pressing down on her small shoulders. Her eyes had a tiredness that he recognized immediately, the same exhaustion he saw in the mirror every morning. At first, he told himself it was none of his business. People came and went from the motel all the time, each carrying their own private stories. But there was something different about her. He noticed how carefully she held her child, how she struggled to juggle groceries while still keeping her baby close. Once, as he opened his door, he saw her trying to calm the crying infant in the hallway. Her voice was soft, trembling with fatigue, yet filled with love. Something inside him stirred a memory of a time when he too had known the sound of a child's laughter. Years ago, he had a little girl of his own. Her name was Lily. She had the brightest smile, the kind that could chase away any storm. But her life was cut short by illness, and he had never forgiven himself for not being able to protect her. Losing her broke his marriage and shattered his world. Since then, he had carried the emptiness like a shadow that never left. Watching the young mother next door reminded him of all he had lost, but strangely, it also reminded him that life had once been full of meaning. One evening, Daniel sat by the window, listening. Through the thin motel walls, he could hear the faint sound of the baby's cries. He closed his eyes, memories flooding back of nights he had spent walking the floor with Lily in his arms, humming lullabies until she slept. The cries next door were different, but the feeling was the same, a reminder that children depended on the love of someone who would never give up on them. He thought about knocking on her door, offering to help, but fear held him back. He had spent so long living in silence, avoiding others, that he didn't know if he had the right words anymore. What if she thought he was interfering? What if she didn't want a stranger involved in her life? So, he stayed in his room, his hands resting on his knees, torn between wanting to help and wanting to disappear. The next day, Daniel stepped outside to smoke a cigarette he didn't really want. He just needed the air. That's when he saw her again. She was returning from the store, a bag in one hand, her baby balanced on the other arm. The bag looked heavy, and she shifted uncomfortably, clearly struggling to manage both. Daniel hesitated, his instinct telling him to step forward, to offer to carry the bag. But he stayed rooted to the spot. His voice caught in his throat, and by the time he considered moving, she had already disappeared into her room. He cursed himself quietly. It had been so long since he had spoken kindly to someone, so long since he had offered a helping hand. He felt trapped inside his own silence. But when he closed his eyes, he could still see the way her arms shook as she tried to hold everything together, both literally and emotionally. He knew that look. He had lived with it himself for years. That night, the motel was unusually quiet. The usual sounds of televisions and late-night arguments from other rooms were absent. Instead, there was only the soft, steady rain tapping against the windows. Daniel sat in the dark, thinking of the woman next door. He didn't know her name. He didn't know her story. But he knew pain when he saw it, and he knew strength too. She had both. As he drifted to sleep, he thought of his daughter again, the way she used to fall asleep against his chest, her small breaths warming his shirt. He remembered how helpless he had felt when she was sick, how powerless he was when the doctors couldn't save her. That helplessness had never left him. But now, hearing the faint cries of the baby next door, he felt something different, a quiet urge to protect, even if it was just by being near. The following morning, Daniel caught another glimpse of her. She stood outside her door, adjusting the strap of her bag while her baby fussed in her arms. Their eyes met briefly. She gave a polite, tired smile, the kind of smile people wear when they don't want to show how much they're struggling. Daniel gave a small nod in return. It was nothing more than a silent exchange between neighbors, but it lingered with him long after she went back inside. In that moment, he realized something he hadn't admitted to himself in years. He wanted to feel connected again. For too long, he had lived like a ghost, hiding from the world. But now, a young mother and her child had unknowingly reminded him that he was still alive, still capable of noticing, still capable of caring. He didn't know what would come of it, but for the first time in a long time, Daniel felt a faint spark of purpose flicker inside him. Emily, on the other side of the wall, had no idea that the man next door was watching out for her in silence. She didn't know that he, too, carried a past filled with loss and sorrow. She thought he was just another stranger in a rundown motel. But what she didn't realize was that their stories were quietly drawing closer, like two paths that had been broken long ago, slowly finding a way to meet again. That evening the motel seemed quieter than usual, as if the rain outside had hushed the world. Emily sat on the edge of her bed, rocking her son in her arms. He was crying again, his tiny fists waving restlessly in the air. She tried humming, she tried patting his back, but nothing seemed to help. Exhaustion pulled at her, and tears stung her eyes. She hadn't eaten properly all day, and the stress of the divorce mixed with the endless worry about tomorrow left her trembling. She stepped into the narrow hallway, hoping that maybe a change of air would calm her baby. She paced back and forth, whispering lullabies, but the cries only grew louder. Her shoulders slumped, and she leaned against the wall, feeling as though she was failing at everything. "Please, sweetheart," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Just sleep a little." The door beside hers opened slowly. Daniel stood there, his face hesitant, as if unsure whether to speak. Emily glanced at him nervously. She had noticed him before in passing but had never spoken to him. He looked worn, like life had pressed him down for years, yet there was something gentle in his eyes. "Is he okay?" Daniel asked softly, his voice low and cautious, not wanting to scare her. Emily shifted, embarrassed. "He's just restless. I don't know what to do anymore." Her words trembled with exhaustion, and for the first time, she admitted out loud how helpless she felt. Daniel stepped a little closer, though not too close. "May I?" he asked, nodding toward the crying child. Emily froze. She didn't know this man, and every instinct told her to be careful. But something about his voice carried sincerity, not pity, not judgment. It was the way he asked, not assuming, not forcing, just offering. Against her doubts, she nodded slowly and carefully placed her baby into his arms. To her surprise, Daniel held the child with natural ease, as if he had done it countless times before. He swayed gently, patting the baby's back in a slow rhythm. He hummed a tune, not loud, just enough for the baby to hear. Within minutes, the cries softened into whimpers, and then into quiet breaths. The little boy's head rested against Daniel's shoulder, and his tiny fists unclenched. Emily's jaw dropped slightly. "How did you do that?" she whispered, half amazed and half relieved. Daniel looked down at the child, his face softening with memories. "I used to have a daughter," he said quietly. "Long ago. I remember what worked for her." His voice cracked slightly, though he tried to hide it. Emily's eyes filled with sympathy. She wanted to ask more, but she could see in his face that the memory carried pain. She simply whispered, "Thank you." They stood in the hallway for a moment, the rain tapping on the windows. For the first time since arriving at the motel, Emily felt a strange kind of peace. She wasn't completely alone in her struggle. There was someone, even if a stranger, who understood what it meant to carry heavy burdens. Daniel handed her son back gently, his hand steady and careful. "He's a strong one," he said, smiling faintly. "Babies know when their mothers are tired. Sometimes they cry just to remind you that you're doing more than you think." Emily laughed softly, a sound she hadn't made in weeks. "That's one way to look at it," she replied. From that night, something changed. Their silence slowly gave way to small exchanges. The next morning, Daniel offered a polite nod as they crossed paths outside. Emily smiled back, a little less tired than before. Later, when she struggled to carry a heavy bag of supplies from the store, Daniel stepped forward without asking and took the bag from her hand. She wanted to refuse out of pride, but she let him help, realizing how much lighter things felt when someone else shared the weight. In the evenings, when the baby fussed, Daniel sometimes knocked gently and asked if she needed a hand. He never overstayed, never intruded, but his presence began to feel like a quiet reassurance. For Emily, who had spent so long feeling invisible, his small acts of kindness meant more than she could admit. One night, after putting her son to sleep, Emily sat outside on the small bench near the motel entrance. The air was cool, and the sound of crickets filled the silence. Daniel appeared a few minutes later, carrying a cup of coffee in a paper cup. He sat on the other side of the bench, leaving space between them, but his presence felt comforting rather than intrusive. "You don't sleep much, do you?" he asked. Emily shook her head. "Not really. My mind doesn't let me." He nodded slowly, staring into the distance. "I know the feeling. Nights can be the hardest." For a while, they sat in silence, each lost in their own thoughts. Then Emily spoke, her voice low. "I never thought I'd end up here. A motel, no plan, just surviving. I feel like I failed at everything." Daniel turned to her, his eyes steady. "You didn't fail. You left something that was breaking you. That takes strength. And you're raising your child alone. That's not failure. That's courage." Her eyes filled with tears, though she quickly wiped them away. No one had told her that before. Everyone else looked at her as though she was just another broken woman. But Daniel's words reached a part of her that had been buried under fear and shame. "And you?" she asked softly. "What brought you here?" Daniel hesitated. He rarely spoke of his past, but for some reason, her presence made it easier. "I lost my daughter. Years ago. She was sick. After she passed. I lost everything else too. My marriage, my work, my sense of who I was. I've been drifting ever since. Emily's chest ached at his words. She wanted to say something, but no words seemed enough. Instead, she simply whispered, "I'm sorry." He gave a faint smile. Life has a way of breaking us in places we never expect. But sometimes, those breaks make room for something new. They sat together until the night grew colder, sharing a silence that wasn't empty but full of unspoken understanding. For Emily, it was the first time she didn't feel completely alone since the divorce. For Daniel, it was the first time he had spoken of his daughter without drowning in sorrow. The baby stirred inside the room, and Emily stood up to go back. "Thank you," she said softly, not just for the coffee or the company, but for reminding her that kindness still existed in the world. Daniel nodded. "Anytime." As she walked back into her room, holding her son close, she realized that meeting the man next door was not an accident. Life had placed two broken souls beside each other, and though they didn't know what it meant yet, she felt that their paths were beginning to intertwine in a way that might change both of their lives. The weeks began to pass quietly at the motel, and what had first felt like a place of shame slowly became a place of small beginnings. Emily started to notice how her days felt different. Before, she would spend most of her time locked inside her room, worrying about the future, drowning in fear of what came next. But now, there were small moments that gave her hope, moments that came from her unlikely neighbor. Daniel never forced himself into her life. He never pushed, never asked for more than she was ready to give. Instead, he appeared when she seemed to need him most. Sometimes it was as simple as carrying her bags. Other times it was sharing a quiet meal in the small motel kitchen area. Those meals became a routine neither of them admitted to at first. She would prepare something simple, and he would sometimes bring bread, fruit, or a carton of milk. They would sit across from each other, her son in a baby chair between them, and talk in ways that made the gray walls of the motel fade away. Through those conversations, Emily learned pieces of Daniel's story that he had never shared with anyone in years. He told her about the business he once owned, how he used to build houses that stood proudly in different parts of the city. His voice carried a mixture of pride and sorrow when he spoke of those days. He had lost it all after his accident, but Emily noticed that his eyes still lit up when he talked about the work. It wasn't just a job to him, it had been his passion, his identity. In return, she opened up about her own struggles. She spoke of her failed marriage, the constant fights, the loneliness that came even while she was still living with someone. She admitted how afraid she had been to leave, how everyone around her had told her to stay because at least she had stability. But stability, she realized, was not worth her peace. And so she left, even if it meant starting over with almost nothing. Daniel listened with quiet respect, never judging, never interrupting. He had a way of making her feel that her voice mattered, that her pain wasn't something to be ashamed of. Sometimes, when she stumbled over her words, he would simply nod and say, "You did what you had to do," and those words alone made her feel stronger. One afternoon, as the sun dipped lower and painted the motel windows gold, Emily sat outside with her son, watching him try to crawl on the patch of grass nearby. Daniel joined them, carrying 2 cups of tea. They talked about small things: the weather, the news, the silly way the motel sign kept flickering like it couldn't decide whether to stay lit or not. Then the conversation shifted, as it often did, into something deeper. "You've been through so much," Emily said, her eyes studying him. "Yet you still find a way to help me. Why?" Daniel took a slow sip of his tea before answering. "Because I know what it's like to feel invisible. To feel like the world stopped seeing you the moment you broke. I don't want you to feel that way. And maybe," he added softly, "maybe helping you helps me remember that I'm still here too." The honesty in his words touched her deeply. She realized then that his kindness wasn't out of obligation or pity, it was part of his own healing. They were helping each other without even meaning to. Emily began to change because of these moments. She started to believe she could actually build a life again. With Daniel's encouragement, she made a small plan. She went to the library to search for jobs she could apply to. She asked about affordable childcare options in town. She even looked into part-time courses she might take to improve her skills. Each time she shared her progress, Daniel's face lit up with quiet pride, as though he believed in her more than she believed in herself. He didn't stop at encouragement either. One evening, he pulled out an old notebook and began sketching. She leaned over, curious, and saw floor plans filling the pages. "What's this?" she asked. He smiled faintly. "It's what I used to do. Design. Build. I thought maybe I could help you put together a real plan, budgeting, ideas for what you need, even simple repairs if you find a place. You're not alone in this." Her heart swelled with gratitude. For so long, she had carried everything by herself, believing no one would ever step in. Now here was someone who not only supported her emotionally but wanted to help her create something real. It wasn't always easy, of course. There were nights when Emily cried quietly, afraid of failing, afraid her son would grow up without the life she wanted to give him. Daniel too had moments where the shadows of his past caught up to him. She once found him sitting alone outside, staring at the stars with tears in his eyes. She didn't ask what memory haunted him. Instead, she simply sat beside him, letting the silence speak for both of them. That was when she realized how much she cared for him, not in a romantic way yet, but in a way that recognized his pain as deeply as her own. She wanted to give him the same comfort he had given her. Slowly, the walls between them crumbled. Emily began to see Daniel not just as the man next door but as someone who was becoming part of her little family. Her son grew comfortable in his presence, often reaching out to him with tiny hands. Daniel would smile, his whole face softening, as he held the child and whispered gentle words. For a man who had lost so much, those moments were like sunlight breaking through a long storm. One particular day stood out. Emily had gone to an interview for a part-time job at a local cafe. She was nervous, her stomach twisting the whole time, but Daniel encouraged her to try. When she returned to the motel, he was waiting outside, pretending not to pace. The moment she told him she had been offered the job, he really grinned for the first time since she had met him. It was a rare sight, and it filled her with joy. "You see," he said. "You're stronger than you think." That night, Emily sat on her bed and thought about everything that had happened. Just weeks ago, she had checked into this motel feeling like her world had ended. Now, somehow, she was beginning to believe that maybe the ending had only been the beginning. And though she didn't say it out loud, she knew Daniel was at the heart of that change. He was showing her that broken people could still rebuild, that lost souls could still find direction, and that sometimes the most unexpected meetings could shape the rest of your life. As she drifted to sleep with her son by her side, Emily realized she was no longer surviving alone. She was building something new with her child, and perhaps, with the man next door who had quietly become her greatest ally. Emily's life slowly began to change in ways she hadn't believed possible just weeks earlier. The cafe job gave her something she had been missing for a long time: stability. It wasn't glamorous, and the pay wasn't high, but it was honest work. Each morning, she dropped her son off at the small daycare she had managed to find and walked into the cafe with a nervous but growing confidence. She learned how to move quickly between tables, how to smile at customers even when her body ached, and how to handle responsibility without doubting herself every second. Every evening, when she came back to the motel exhausted but proud, Daniel would be waiting. Sometimes he carried an extra meal, sometimes he helped her carry her son inside, and sometimes he simply asked, "How was it today?" Those words, simple as they were, meant the world to her. For the first time in years, someone cared about the little details of her day. Her son grew happier too. He was no longer living in silence, surrounded by tension. Instead, he had laughter. He had Daniel. The bond between them grew naturally. Often, when Emily worked late hours, Daniel would sit with the baby in the lobby or outside under the old neon light, rocking him gently until Emily returned. The child reached for him as easily as he did for his mother, and Daniel's eyes softened each time, as though those small moments healed something deep within him. But it wasn't just Emily who was changing. Daniel, too, seemed to be waking up from a long sleep. He began shaving more regularly, his clothes looked cleaner, and he walked with a little more strength in his step. He even started helping the motel manager with small repairs, fixing broken locks, tightening loose hinges, patching up small holes in the walls. The man who had once locked himself away was slowly returning to the world. One evening, Emily invited him to join her for dinner in her room. She had managed to cook something simple with the small hot plate she kept. It wasn't fancy, but when they sat at the little table, with her son in a high chair babbling happily, it felt like family. They laughed about small things, shared quiet stories, and enjoyed the kind of peace both of them had thought they had lost forever. After the baby fell asleep, they sat quietly, the room filled with the soft sound of the night outside. Emily turned to him and said, "Do you ever think life gives us second chances?" Daniel's eyes grew thoughtful. "I used to think no. I thought once you lose something, that's it. You carry the emptiness forever. But now," he looked at her gently. "Now I think maybe life does give us second chances. They just don't come the way we expect." Emily felt her chest tighten, a warmth spreading through her. She realized that somewhere along the way, the man who had started as a quiet neighbor had become something far more important. He was her friend, her supporter, and maybe even more than that. But she didn't rush the thought. It was enough to know that hope had returned. Days turned into weeks, and weeks into months. Emily saved money from her job, determined to move out of the motel into a proper apartment. Daniel helped her look at listings, reminding her to be practical but never discouraging her dreams. Finally, she found a small place, not big, not fancy, but hers. The day she signed the lease, she stood in the empty apartment with her son in her arms and tears in her eyes. Daniel was there too, holding a small bag of tools, ready to help set up the furniture. "It's not much yet," he said, smiling faintly, "but it's the beginning of something." Emily nodded, her heart full. "It's home." That night, after they finished setting up the little apartment, Emily stood at the door as Daniel prepared to leave. She didn't want him to go, though she didn't say it out loud. Instead, she simply whispered, "Thank you. For everything. I wouldn't have made it here without you." Daniel looked at her, his eyes steady. "You would have. You're stronger than you think. But I'm glad I was here." For a moment, neither moved. Then her son stirred, breaking the silence, and Daniel gave a small nod before walking away. But as Emily closed the door, she realized something important. Her story wasn't one of ending. It was one of beginning. Over time, their connection only deepened. Emily worked hard at the cafe, and Daniel found small repair jobs around town, slowly rebuilding his confidence. They continued to share meals, stories, and laughter, and though neither spoke of it openly, the bond between them grew stronger than words. People at the cafe noticed the change in Emily. She smiled more easily now, her eyes no longer clouded with sadness. She carried herself differently, with a quiet pride. Some asked if she had family nearby, and she would simply smile and say, "Not exactly, but I have someone who helps me more than I can ever explain." For Daniel, the greatest change was within his heart. He still carried the loss of his daughter, but for the first time in years, it didn't crush him completely. Holding Emily's son, hearing his laughter, and sharing in his milestones gave him a sense of purpose he thought he had lost forever. It didn't erase the pain, but it gave him a reason to keep going. One evening, as they sat in Emily's new apartment, Daniel watched her son crawl across the floor, laughing as he tried to grab a toy. Emily sat beside Daniel on the couch, her head resting lightly against the cushion. "Do you ever think," she asked quietly, "that we were meant to meet that way? In that broken little motel?" Daniel thought for a long moment. Then he nodded. "Yes. I think sometimes life brings two broken people together so they can remind each other that healing is possible." Emily smiled softly, her eyes glistening. She didn't need to say anything more. The truth was in the way her son reached out for Daniel, in the way their laughter filled the small apartment, in the way the loneliness that once weighed on them both had lifted. The day she had checked into the motel, Emily had believed her life was over. She thought the divorce had taken everything from her. But what she hadn't known was that life was giving her something new, someone who understood her struggles, who believed in her strength, and who stood by her as she built a new beginning. Daniel, too, had thought his story ended with loss. But in the simple act of helping a young mother calm her crying child, he had found a path back to life, back to purpose, and perhaps back to love. And so, two people who had once been strangers in neighboring motel rooms discovered that sometimes the most broken places can be the beginning of the most beautiful journeys.